First of all, what are some key elements to understand this financing for development process? Okay, and then secondly, let's try and see what may be at stake in the upcoming, iteration of the process itself towards this fourth financing for development conference in Spain, in Sevilla, in June 2025. So first of all, as a brief explainer, and I know sometimes some of these UN jargon and UN things are a bit difficult to crack, because they're a bit distant and far away. But let me try and explain it in 5 quick points. The first one, let's understand the genesis of the process, where it started. The financing for development process started roughly 20 something years ago in after in the 90s. In the United Nations, there has been a sequence of conferences. You're probably familiar with the conference in Rio on sustainable development, the conference in Beijing on women, the conference on social development, basically a whole sequence of conferences that helped shaping the development agenda for the international development community. And all those conferences have put a lot of responsibilities on developing countries. Because of course they added so many qualifications in terms of the kind of development progress and development pathway that they had to embark on. However, those conferences did not provide any clear understanding of where developing countries' governments would find the policy and fiscal space and the resources to advance on those agendas. So in many ways, they were very ambitious in setting agendas, but they were completely silent on how actually to ensure that developing countries would have the means to achieve those agendas. So this is where the Financing for Development Conference comes in, is with the idea that it actually had to respond to the question on how economic, monetary, financial, trade frameworks had to change, had to be reformed in order for developing countries to have that fiscal and policy space. Now, this, of course, was therefore an process under the umbrella of the UN, but would also include the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO. So it's a sort of a macro umbrella process that includes all key economic governance institutions. And it's a process that it's primarily for decision making. It's what we call a global normative process. It's a space where governments take intergovernmental decisions and agreements on how to reform economic governance. And it's meant to span across a whole variety of thematic pillars, from domestic resource mobilizations to trade, debt, international cooperation, systemic financial and monetary issues, and everything which is in between. So it's articulated in a number of action areas. So you're really talking about a comprehensive economic governance reform agenda that covers all different key pillars of economic governance. Now, so that's basically the history, where it comes from. Now, the second piece of history, I think it's important to understand what we meant by financing when we're talking about financing for development, because sometimes this is a term which is a bit misunderstood. And probably in the first place, it's maybe not a happy term for this process, because it kind of evokes the idea of a pledging conference, a place where you look for money to pay for things, right? Now, that's not really what the process is about. Financing is not a good term, because the idea is to really advance systemic reforms, which are both normative reforms and governance reforms. And what do I mean by that? It's normative reforms in the sense of taking decisions on the rules and the rules and the procedures and the, even the binding, agreements that can help has reshaped international law with respect to trade, to finance, tax, debt, and other issues. So it's really trying to redefine a global consensus in terms of international law on how some of these issues have to be governed, but is also to reform the institutions that govern them. So it's both an agenda for institutional and international law sort of reform. Now, this also means that these PRAISE, the Financing for Development PRAISE process, was identified by the Group of 77 as the locus for struggle, right? For really the democratization of economic governance. The idea that it was the space in which they could try and shift the barycenter of decision-making away from the organizations dominated by global north countries that currently actually, take decisions for everyone, whether it's the IMF or the World Bank, whether it's the OECD on tax, on development cooperation, whether it's the WTO, these are all organizations whose power systems, its governance is basically in the hands of developed countries. And of course, we cannot be surprised that the policies that they generate, the programs that they generate, are skewed in favor of those countries themselves. So despite their perennial claim that they are there for development, to advance development, the reality is that they have been the ones advancing a pattern of globalization that primarily serves the interest of those countries and their major multinational corporations. So the struggle, it's really a struggle to reform a governance system towards more democratic institutions and for decision making, because the premise is that only with that global economic democracy, then you can provide the policy and fiscal space to advance on development pathway. So that's, it's important to understand that history and the fact that this has been the space that's been elected by countries of the global south to run that struggle for democratization. Now, what has been the pathway? The pathway is to start with an initial conference in 2002, which took place in Monterrey, Mexico, and that's the reason why you sometimes hear this referred to as the Monterrey Consensus. And in 2002, that generated a very, it's almost amazing for that particular moment in time, political document that really outlines sort of that reform agenda. Throughout, then there's been a Doha review conference in 2008. This is considered the second Financing for Development conference. And then what happens after that is basically the big crisis, right, of those years, the financial crisis. And this is where the G20 is established. The G20 in its present form is established in 2009. It was initially formed in 1999, but that wasn't really at the level of heads of state. It was just an element of coordination between finance minister and central bankers. It's only in that moment that it takes the form that it took today. And it's quite interesting because it took that form in opposition and as a deviation from what was organized under the UN space as the UN Crisis Conference, which is another quite important piece of international law. So it's important to recognize that G20 is an explicit attempt of the US and other countries to basically avoid going the full UN way, try to create a sort of a club around them that would help them drive through without confronting the big issues of democratization of governance. Now, that's an important note because this is where you understand where the G20 and the UN process very often are not very compatible one with the other. Now, Always in the pathway, then we have the third and final conference until now on financing for development in Addis Ababa in 2015, which generated the so-called Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Now, I don't have time to explain what happened in great detail there, but maybe two important elements. One element which you can define of so-called retrogression, because of the proximity and the integration with the 2030 agenda negotiations, this is where there was a very, very strong push by developed countries to try and undermine the systemic reform agenda and highlight much more the financing, pure financing agenda. That's where sometimes you hear FfD being referred as the fundraising space or the financing space for the SDGs. I mean, if you want to finance the SDGs, where do we find the money? And unfortunately, this has led to a very, very strong, role of private finance or narrative about how private finance could step in and fill the financing gap, which I think was very problematic in Addis. The second, on the other side, is that Addis was also the moment that really elevated the struggle for tax governance to the highest negotiation point in that particular moment. Our good friend, Derece, coordinator of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, used to say, we achieved defeat in Addis. Why? Because the struggle for developing countries from the group of 77, in particular the Africa group, to really win a UN-centered tax governance process was basically the highlight of the conference and was basically the single entry, most important negotiation of Addis. It didn't work out, but I think, as Chennai will soon tell us, eventually it created the foundation for that victory at a later point in time. So I think it's important to highlight Addis with these two opposite tensions. On one hand, the push for the financing agenda to erode that sort of systemic understanding of financing for development, and on the other hand, the push for a global tax body, which was exactly the opposite, really reinforcing the notion that we need to fix governance in order than to fix policies. Now, what was good, however, of all of these is that there was an institutionalization of an annual follow-up process within the UN, the creation of this annual FfD forum, which takes place back-to-back with the spring meetings, which created an annual spotlight under the UN to really discuss some of these issues and created in many ways a very fertile ground for the ongoing struggle to continue. Now, to conclude on this part and then very briefly address the second point, it's safe to say, what has it achieved after 20 years or so? Well, I think it's important to recognize that it really generated a counter process led by developing countries to contrast the hegemony of developed country institutions. On literally every area of development governance, economic governance, the UN space served to say that there was actually another way, another path which was necessary. So on tax, it created a space to counter the hegemony of the OECD and insist on the democratization of tax regime governance. On debt, it's insisted on the inadequacy of creditor-centered governance, where basically debt is exclusively driven by the creditors, into a more open democratic space into the UN, and so forth, according to all the areas. So it's been really a locus for struggle, and eventually it worked, because that long struggle led to the initiation of the process for a UN tax convention on international development on international cooperation on tax. And I think that's, I leave that to Chennai to articulate that. Lastly, fine, that sounds very celebratory, but what are its blind spots? Well, one I think I've already mentioned. There's been some erosion of this strong focus on systemic reforms because of this sustainable development financing gap narrative. And I think pretty much the reason why I'm highlighting this is because this is an element in leading towards FfD4. Secondly, I think there's been a disconnect between development finance, whether talking about tax or debt, and real economy transformation. And ultimately, we know very well that most of our challenges, even within tax or debt, will never be addressed if the structure of the economy doesn't change. And I think this has been facilitated by the fact that there's been areas of the FfD agenda that have been captured respectively by the WTO, trade, and by the G20, global financial and monetary regulation, And lastly, the FfD process has been largely silent on climate. Why? Because the moment in which the Addis Ababa Action Agenda was negotiated, there was also a negotiation of the Paris Agreement, and therefore it was clear that climate and all finance mechanism related to climate will be negotiated there rather than in FfD. So I think these are important blind spots. And it's quite easy because that, Shem, allows me to enter into what's happening now. And then I close in 2 minutes. So alongside with the decision to initiate the UN Framework Convention on Tax, there was also a decision to host the 4th Financing for Development Conference. And that basically means that all of these blind spots create the context for that negotiation. That negotiation is happening now, basically the zero draft of the negotiation text should be available in early January after a discussion in the first week of December on the so-called elements paper, something that is generated just to show what are the key elements that should be addressed in the context of the negotiations. And basically in the next 6 months, between basically December to May, there will be quite an intense intergovernmental process of discussion and negotiation on what is the final agreement. And the conference, to some extent, is just the ending moment. There's always a lot of emphasis of the conference. The reality, the conference in most cases happens when the negotiations are concluded. So it's a sort of a final party, where what needs to be celebrated can be celebrated, and what needs to be actually, unfortunately, denounced can be denounced. It's possible sometimes, as is happening now, is that 1 or 2 issues remain open. And of course, that's what we always hope as civil society, because then we can campaign more forcefully under, the public scrutiny of the big conference, rather than in the corridors of the UN in the negotiation phase. But still, it's important to notice that the important period is the negotiation, not so much the conference. Now, what do we expect the big issues to be? And right now, I think I'll just outline them, without getting into... Well, the first issue is going to be the protection or the attack by others on the UN tax convention process. I think even if it's the tax convention as its own process, I think it will be a locus for struggle, On one side, mostly the Africa Group to maintain its integrity and comprehensiveness. On the other one, to try and break it into pieces, okay? So I think the tax, even if it's not its purpose, but I think will still be an important element of the negotiation. But the 2 most important areas, at least from the initial steps of the process, are going to be debt governance and international development cooperation. These, I think, are the 2 critical issues. Then I think there will be a number of other elements related to MDB reform, issues related to maybe some particular trade issues, in particular sanctions, unilateral sanctions, including unilateral sanctions under the name of climate, you know, the new CBAM approach of the EU, for instance. These are also going to be quite contentious. And also the follow-up process, you know, because some countries would want to, as usual, try to undermine the continuation of this particular UN track, and others want to strengthen it and give it further shape. So these are going to be a lot of at least the macro map of the big issues that will be negotiated. I think I'll come with our proposal, Shem, as we get into the second round. But this is just to give an initial historical overview and some initial hints of where the FfD process goes from this point onwards. Thanks.